Welcome once again to The Lost Signals discusses games and gaming culture, a pretentious, philosophical, pedantic podcast where we focus on various aspects of video games as well as other issues and topics within gaming in general. Hello there, welcome back to Lost Signals Games and Gaming Culture. I, of course, remain your host, Scott Thurlow. I'm here tonight with Stephen Omosi.
Pleased to meet you.
And Chris Morgan.
Rattling your bones.
And as has become our sort of tradition for games is it's now fall/Halloween season, and we usually cover some aspect of horror games, usually an article, which we did last year, and this year we'll do the same again. And the article in question is called The Mechanics of Tension by Chris Pruitt, and I found this on Gamasutra, and it was from 2016. So last year we sort of discussed like the psychological aspects that games use to like create effective horror and make a good game within the genre. This one talks about, as I mentioned, the mechanics, like the actual design and the design elements and so forth, that anything that isn't plot or narrative or characters that goes into a horror game and how they can be used effectively and when and in what context to use them to create like the most effective engagement with the player.
Right.
So it's a pretty good article overall, and there's just one line from the intro before he breaks it down to a couple of sections, which we'll go into shortly. But there is one line, like, of course, I always say this in general when I'm gushing over just my eyes alight talking about video games and like how awesome of a medium it is. But he does say here that the creation of tension in video games is a fascinating problem from game designers. To me, that just means like it's so much harder to do in games versus many other mediums. And he goes into it why. But that's just the line I picked out that sort of is kind of a general thesis. And now we'll go on to the sections.
But I just want to say something, because it just occurred to me when you were talking about, and it occurred to me before when I was reading the article. A lot of the things he's pointing out that makes a quality game, and this will go to like how games are an art form. It's just like these rules should be standard, except for the specific things in movies and TV shows too. Because listening to the way he adapted a lot of the stuff we're going to talk about to games is stuff like, God damn, I wish that was in the genre as far as movies go.
Well,
sure.
I think it's interesting. I like the way that he lays all these different things out for the reader, and really this is aimed at a game designer, but I think it speaks a lot to anybody who plays specifically horror games, because not only does it talk about the differences between horror games and other types of games and like what those differences are, which I think is really interesting, and like some of them are specifically like don't do the things that other games do in a horror game because it'll be
backfire,
scary.
Essentially, yeah.
But it also outlines a little bit like why certain things work in video games and not in TV and movies. And like,
yeah, for sure.
Or, taking it the other way, like vice versa. There are certain things that work in movies and TV and that don't work in video games because they are a passive activity, whereas video games are an active activity. To a much larger extent, anyway.
Yep.
But anyway, that's my little preamble.
No, you're right. Like, good point. Like, it's always, like you said, interesting to discuss like how the differences and what, again, the uses of them can be and effectiveness of them. So yeah, he does mention, like you said, he's a developer, and he mentions his game which is called Dead Secret, a bit like sort of saying, here's a broad sort of topic, and here's what we tried to do, like here and there. So he's sort of like, I don't want to say he's like, self-aggrandizing. He's like, hey, also we did this and that in our game, but it's fine. I haven't heard of Dead Secret. Apparently it's a VR game, which seems cool. I guess it shipped back in 2016, whenever. But regardless, let's move on to his actual sort of breakdown of the mechanics of tension. So the first little section after the intro is thinking in context, and I think Steve-O, you had a couple of things to say about that?
Well, yeah, I mean, so it's interesting the way he goes into this is like, I love how he says, like, the first sentence lays it right out. Is like, as a horror game designer, your most important task is to focus the player on narrative context rather than underlying game systems, which happens differently in a lot of games. Like, a lot of times you're focusing on how to, like, min-max, things like that.
Or a puzzle game or whatever.
Right. Basically, go through this game in the best way. Like, in a horror game, you kind of think about things differently. You kind of are in the don't die mode.
Sure, or at least good ones will get you to that.
If it's done
state.
well, the designers are thinking about this exact sentence right here is like, you have to focus the player on what's happening in the story, which all games should do to an extent, but like there is a lot more leeway there to be like, all right, here's a cool thing that we had. Like, I just played the new Spider-Man game. It's like, they got a bunch of cool, web slinging is like super fun. Like the story's good, but in that game, the story kind of serves all the cool other, like, either in-universe stuff
mechanics,
or the cool new game mechanics that they have, because being Spider-Man is just a lot of fun, whereas in a horror game, you have to serve the story for sure as a designer, because that's the only way you can get somebody engulfed enough in it to be scared of the things that are happening.
And that's exactly what made me think do the movie correlation, because something like Dying Late, Scott and I
we both quite enjoyed that.
We enjoyed it, but we both agreed that the side missions were vastly more interesting than the
main arc.
The main arc, because that was like what I'd consider to be like an action horror game. So like the mechanics, like there were some scary things, like when the sun went down and you had
they became all more aggressive. And
the nighttime changed up the game, but in terms of narrative, it was basically talk to this person, go do this mission, and it was much something like less immersive than like say Resident Evil 7.
Right. So I'm glad you brought up Res Evo, because I'm going to bring it up a couple of times, and I think he does too, even later on. But that whole franchise as well, I would say, as a series, has some good and bad examples of like some of the things he talks about. But I was going to bring up, like you said, Sivo, one of the famous things from all the Res Evos is solving like some like weird puzzle. Get 3 lion head keys or whatever the fuck, right? So you're thinking about that. It's still like basically a puzzle solving, but it's within context, because the when done well, the story is telling you like these are important items, or items that are relevant, even though they're just basically 1, 2, 3, like the classic like 3 like Zelda kind of thing. Like you're just basically getting the right pieces to a puzzle, but it has context to it, so therefore it becomes more meaningful. Yeah. Rather than just like if it were just like a straight up puzzle game, like match these 3 shapes or whatever.
I don't never. Oh, sorry.
Well, I was gonna say I don't know why, but that reminds me so much of Legends of the Hidden Temple.
Sure.
When like you have to find the 3 parts of the monkey, but you never know where that temple guard is going to jump out at you. Like that's kind of the thing that you're aiming for. Is like right, always in the back of your head, the narrative might pop out at any moment and like just fucking do something weird or creepy or whatever.
And it's somewhat of a jump scare, which he also covers. But that's basically the thinking in context sort of idea. Right. Sorry, Chris, did you have anything else?
I was thinking definitely in terms of Resident Evil 7. But I think a good game mechanic with puzzles, because he talks about like subverting expectations, is to, you make a puzzle or something meaningful to the game, but the puzzle in itself, is it going to open a door? Is it going to give you something you need? Is it going to give you a clue? Is it going to give you a weapon? And I like that random aspect of it when done well. It's not like, here's another chest where I'm going to get either bullets or blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
Something like this, when you're building in a mystery, it's good, as he says here, or maybe later on, to make even the little details somewhat not consistent.
Yeah, for sure. So then he goes on to, that's a brief section. So the next one, it's just meaningful failure. So like, how do you impart like how do you make the death of your avatar like meaningful to you as a player, or like impactful in some sense? And he mentions a game that Chris and I both really love ever since it came out, was Alien Isolation.
I was actually going to ask you guys about this. What is the slow, because I didn't play it. What is the slow save?
All right, so check it out. We mentioned it way back in like some very early episodes. What happens is, the way it works in Alien Isolation is you have to get to certain like phone boosts. Like you can only save at certain spots on the map. You can't just save whenever you want. You have to get there, and once you're there, you have to basically like a button prompt. You have to hold it down long enough to basically like swipe a card or some kind of animation.
So if something's chasing you, you can't really.
You can't just run there and tap a button. Like if the alien's on you, you're gonna fucking die.
Yeah.
So like that ties into what he says. Like a common way to do it, a la that, is to make it so the player loses progress. So like it really sucks if you're like spent 20 minutes like doing what you need to do, and then aliens on you, and then you almost make it there, and then you die. Like that's a lot of tension.
I really love that idea of like you have to put your like. Basically, you have to hang your ass out in the breeze to like actually get a save.
Yeah, dude, and it was super effective in isolation. Like it created a lot of tension there because of the way they made the save system.
Right. Especially since like in Alien Isolation, rarely do you have a straight up fight. It's always
Yeah,
You're always
for sure.
hiding from shit. So, okay, there's the little phone you have to connect, and you have to do it, like, say, between, like, when an android's patrol's going on, or
whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, or you got to make sure that the noise has
Or
gone
the rattling
away.
is
And,
moving away from you. Yeah.
So I really like that aspect of it. It was a pain in the ass. But it kept the game interesting.
Exactly. I know it was somewhat contentious at the time, but I thought it was effective. Yes, I certainly got screwed over by like I made it there, but not enough time to do it. But it still added a lot of tension and a lot of like the atmosphere was increased because of it, I would say.
And Silent Hill does that too.
Yeah, he mentions that, and he mentions ones you like.
I was going to say I have to quickly mention that he definitely points out Dark Souls in this, which is a brutal save system. Especially the first Dark Souls is completely brutal, but like when you actually make it to the next bonfire, it's such a relief, and like you feel so good.
You feel a sense of accomplishment.
You get like a little release of serotonin or whatever, and you're happy for a little.
Exactly, for sure, because they're like, oh shit, I made it to the bonfire, I'm good. And also, like, as collecting your souls, what does he say? It's a more modern version of this tension as progress cost system, which I thought was well phrased and makes sense. So then he moves on to rule obfuscation, which I'll just quickly bring up Resident Evil because he does too. So this is the one you were sort of talking precast where the UI is not as like robust as it would be in other games, which seems like a mark against it. But as you had mentioned, Steve-O, in terms of horror games, sometimes you have to change up the rules.
It's done for tension.
Yeah, in order to create that. So for example, like in Resident Evil, like starting with 2, definitely actually 1, I'm sorry, all of them, at least the early ones, there was no health. There was a health indicator, but it was very vague, like good, fine, like danger, caution, right? So you had like some vague idea, but you had no idea exactly like what the numbers were underneath the hood, if you will, which created some kind of tension. Like, should I use an herb now, or should I save one? Should I wait for like a bigger one so I can combine it, etc.? It does add a little bit of layer there to that. Other stuff too, were like, for example, like many games would have waypoints or like tell you exactly where to go. That would probably remove a lot of the tension in a horror game if you knew exactly what room to go to, like immediately, instead of like searching through like, oh man, there might be a monster or whatever.
One of my favorite things in horror games is when they have like really good sound design and you know where you're going by like, but that becomes your indicator of where you're going. Like instead of having a arrow that points to where you're supposed to go on the map, you have to like follow sounds.
Yeah,
like
sure.
And that's the kind of stuff that I really like. And that type of screwing with you. Like he actually mentions his own game here, Dead Secret, where he removed the concept of a safe room, so you're not really safe anywhere, and that's interesting. Like that just, I'm not sure if I would like that. Like
it
sometimes
seems like
you need like that
bold idea, Cotton. Yeah.
Sometimes you need that like little bit of downtime in a especially in a horror game where you're like, but it could be like if done well, I think it could be really interesting and good. So I don't.
Well, the thing is, back to Alien Isolation. Basically, when you have the alien running around, and later on the aliens running around, the safer place, not this, is a locker.
Sure.
If you can make it to a locker, and you can
that's
hide,
essentially it's the safest room you could possibly be. Sure.
But by the same token, if the alien enters it, you've got to back up and hold your breath.
For sure. So like, it's almost like an iteration, right? In Resident Evil and other things like it, you had like a completely safe room where you know you were fine, nothing can get you. Isolation sort of had that, and apparently in his game, he's like, well, I removed the concept of safe room.
Yeah.
Now, to be fair, his game is in VR, and none of us played it, so maybe it like helps in that.
Yeah.
For that like angle for it.
But in Resident Evil 7, I noticed like to get to a safe room, you kind of had to earn it.
Sure.
Like,
I mean, that's always kind of been the case.
You had to, whatever was following you, you either had to defeat it or to set it someplace else.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, it could follow you, and you had to be careful there too, because you don't know
that's why it was a well done game, because like that they never let you forget that like something could be on your tail. Like you're not always 100%. I'm in the clear here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So then he moves on to like somewhat more of a physiological thing. It's heart rate elevation. So he mentions that there's research done that people are more likely to feel the experience of fear or scared if they're in a state of physical arousal, which makes sense, obviously. So it's I like how he says it. The mechanism involved is a brain hack called misattribution of arousal. So, like, your heart rate's up, your adrenaline's pumping, your hands are maybe sweating a bit, and that puts you in a state that he mentions here, that being susceptible to a quote-unquote false emotion. So, like, your brain just, because of evolution, because of the way our humanity's bodies works, there's a chance that your brain will mistake the physical response for fear and then induce you to becoming afraid, which is pretty cool. Again, it seems like a dirty psychological trick, but it's innocuous enough, I would say, when done in a game.
Yeah.
But it could be very, very conducive to, for the game and for the atmosphere, to bringing that state with you, which is sort of the thrill of playing horror games to an extent.
And again, I am definitely one of those that squeezes control and sweats, but I also know, again, it's something like Alien.
It's disgusting.
And I keep bringing this up because it is probably the perfect.
He's drenching sweat right now, everyone.
Perfect horror simulator is like an Alien Isolation or something where you have to hold your breath. I mean, I found myself me holding my breath.
Sure, and that's kind of exactly what he's talking about.
Which, we keep bringing up the same games, but that is a testament to, okay, these games, that's what, these games did all these things. They may not be completely flawless, but they did all these things that you're supposed to do.
Now, I'll mention a couple, I know, that's kind of a touchstone, and Resident Evil for me, but I will say a more modernish one that I quite liked, and I think you, Chris, played a bit of it, was called Soma, which is really good, and it's pretty good about that because it sort of ties into some other stuff he's going to say later, but in that game, you have no way of fighting back, which is not all survival horror games have that, but many of them do because, again, it is very helpful for raising tension and imparting your feelings and emotions onto the avatar because there's no way you're disempowered essentially.
What the hell are you going to do against an alien?
Yeah, right. So that was pretty good because they would just chase you around and sometimes they'd be jump scares, but not always. Sometimes you could see them wandering around, but if they turn the wrong direction or if you turn the wrong corner, then it would be there and it would again. It's tied into jump scares, but also the tension he's mentioning here, making you sweat, oh, it might be right around the corner or whatever, right? So it's heightening your physiological response, which may be then heightening your engagement with the game.
What was that game? It was another one where you couldn't combat everything. You had a camera or a video camera.
Oh, Outlast.
Yeah.
That was a great example of that.
Well, the first one was great. Second one, not so much.
Yeah,
but you're right. You're right. I do agree. That was a solid horror game. So that's sort of the to tie into the last seasons, the more emotional / physiological thing. The next one is character design, which he points out that the player, optimally would feel scared for his or her avatar. Therefore, you need a character that's easy to put in danger. Sort of ties into what I mentioned just before, where you can have an everyman character or every person, we'll say, but you can then impart a little bit of yourself onto it. Therefore, you're feeling what your avatar is feeling or is supposed to be feeling in the story and context of the game as well.
This one gave me a little bit of an interesting take on the heroes of games, right? Because it makes a good point where if your character avatar is a complete badass, then whatever you're fighting against
way more badass than
has to be so much far beyond, which is why it's so much probably better to make your character just an everyman or even somebody who has slight deficiencies in especially physically, so you feel completely overwhelmed by whatever is trying to hunt you down. And I really like that as an idea of this is important for a horror game. You cannot
it's a consideration
be overpowering. You can't just come in, stomp the shit out of everything and
walk
out because then it's not scary.
I mean, here's the thing, right? Is Doom a horror game because you're essentially murdering literal demons from hell and they're scared of you?
Doom was kind of the first one that popped into my head. I didn't know I was going to talk about it, but now that you brought it up, I'm going
Go
to.
ahead.
Doom is a really interesting version of this. There are when I played especially the new Doom, well, even the old ones. Forget about Doom 3 or whatever it was.
Doom 2015 or 16, whenever it came out.
No, yeah, that one. The new one was really good. The one in between that and the old games was terrible. But
yes, Doom 3 tried to be a horror game and completely failed.
But it's weird because Doom 3 used all of this shit that he's talking
just
about
badly. They didn't put it together correctly.
I guess so. I don't think that's it. I think it was because when you play in Doom, you're supposed to be a badass fucking space marine.
That's a pretty good point too.
Sure. I don't know if it was done badly. I just think it wasn't a Doom game, right? You're sneaking around with a fucking flashlight that turns off every once in a while. This is a survival horror game. Doom is not survival horror at all.
Yeah.
Doom is stomp your fucking
demons into dust
into the fucking ground horror, which is such a weird thing. It's so hard to make a game like that good, and the fact that they've made at least 3 good versions of Doom is pretty impressive. Yeah, especially like spanning the last like fucking 25 years or however.
Because the ones that were good didn't try to be a horror game. The one that tried to failed. I think that's a good point because of what we just pointed out. I wouldn't have thought about it either, but it's possible that contributes a lot to like why it doesn't feel like either a good Doom game or a good horror game.
Exactly.
And maybe it's the because it goes back into the action horror where you get caught up. You have to be in that. All right, I'll use the aliens thing. I'm not as fond of Aliens plural as I am of 1 and 3. I think 1 is a perfect movie because I think it would be, and I'm relating this to Doom. I think it's harder to go from an action movie to a suspense film or a video game than it is to go from something suspense and then make you a badass.
Yeah.
Because
exactly,
you have to lose so many things that, like, instead of like having something basic that's simple and very cool, if you want to like kind of spice up with action, you got to make everybody act a badass. You ramp up the number of creatures, their abilities and everything.
Etc. Yeah.
So I think with Doom, it would have had to have made that choice right away. I'm just speaking to your point because I'm listening to what you're saying. I've never played a single Doom, and I saw the ending of the movie, and that sucked. But
it's really strange that you haven't.
First of all, play all the Dooms.
Well, play 1, 2,
except
and the new
except for 3. Secondly, if we could never mention that fucking movie again, that'd be great.
No, we're just gonna keep coming up.
Yeah, it's
but
go on.
I did want to bring up. Well, we're getting. I'll bring it up at another point. But.
All right, we're getting to what you want to talk about in a sec.
Yeah,
yeah. Like you guys are right. Or I think he makes a good point, and I think we agree that it seems strange. Like I was going to bring up another one. You like? I know you like, Chris. We haven't mentioned yet. Oddly, Dead Space is a good one because
I was going to bring that up. That was what I was going
to say. That you're both like powerful and not like you're not the fucking Space Marine from Doom. But you're also not a nobody. Like, you have tools and so forth. But it feels overwhelming because there's so many things. And the design of them, like, this maybe... He hasn't mentioned this really, but the enemy design is fucking ridiculous. Like, you're not... It forces you to rethink what you're normally trained to do against enemies, which is a really interesting mechanic. You have to cut off their limbs and then stomp them. Like, you can't just... If you headshot them, sometimes that's worse. Yeah, Resident Evil did that too. But nevertheless, the mechanic is methodically chopping shit. So, like, they empower you enough... But there's so many of them, and if they get to you, you're fucking screwed.
And the cool thing is, you're fighting with mining equipment until a certain part of the game.
That's good context as well.
Which is cool, because he like you say, he's not quite an everyman, but he is a miner, he's an astronaut, and all that stuff.
You're an engineer on space.
You're an engineer, and so it's like, okay, you've got a working knowledge of X, Y, and Z things, but you're definitely
he's not like a fucking badass. Yeah,
that's what I'm saying.
I mean. Yeah, exactly. That's what I'm bringing up.
And that Dead Space was what I was actually going to bring up. And I was like, maybe I can wait till later. But since you brought it up,
yeah, go ahead.
I think Chris, you were talking about like ramping up from suspense to action. Like Dead Space did that. I mean, like they definitely did.
Yeah, there's no kind of about it. They definitely want it to be an action game.
You're right, but like, but the first game was like super suspenseful.
Yes,
and like, I think they did it pretty well.
I agree. I think it kind of went down. 2 was okay. 3 was just like, hey, let's do all out action. Like, okay, that's great, but like, now we're just playing Gears of War essentially.
But I just found Dead Space is actually the exception to the rule, maybe, but maybe because it started as more of a suspense game. When action, the last DLC was virtually no action at all,
and that's why it felt like a better Dead Space game than the
so it kind of like went back to its roots as opposed to.
I think they knew like they fucked up a bit. But no, that's a good point, and that's a good one. So we'll move on to, I think this is one of the bigger ones, pop-out scares, as he calls them, or jump scares, as we often say and more familiar with. And so I'll just read a couple lines that I thought, like, of course I agree with, and we probably all said this even regarding movies and shit that we've seen, but pop-out scares are effective but short-lived, and they tire the viewer out. That is absolutely true, right? Many players consider them to be cheap, but when used properly, they, I like how he says, they wind the crank of tension, the tension crank, right? That's true, I think. So it's sort of like a primer, and I like how he says the point of a jump scare is not to scare the player, but to make him worry about the next jump scare, which is kind of cool. Like, yeah, ideally there should never be a next one, right? So it's like a slow roll. Like, so like you are wound up, and then they roll you back down again. And movies do that too, to an extent, but as we brought up earlier, since you're more actively engaged with the game, like it's more of a responsiveness, I would say.
And I think like movies, I think like the best games, and these are probably foremost on my mind, but something where a jump scare isn't just something that pops out of you, but is something that doesn't necessarily leap out at you, but is all of a sudden there, like, again, the aliens or the mud tar creatures from Resident Evil 7, or
yes, I was going to bring up
virtually anything in Resident Evil 4.
I'll bring up another one.
Because nothing jumps out at you, but
I know what you mean.
They're a slow burn for pop out.
Exactly. So there's two games that I really like. He mentions, and we've actually covered a bit of it. Thomas Grip is one of the lead developers of the Amnesia games, and Amnesia: The Dark Descent was the first one, and then Machine for Pigs. They both sort of do that too, where like you can jump scare yourself essentially, which is like pretty cool. Like there's no like scripted ones, which is one, of course, that's very famous that he mentions. I'll get to in a second. But in terms of that, I'm just saying those games are very good about like balancing the jump scares out, spreading them out very nicely, and not like overwhelming you. And he also says like if you do too few, then you're going to forget about it, and like then the crank of tension is now wound back down just because you haven't paced it out correctly.
What do you guys think of jump scare death scenes?
It depends, right? It's all context. When done well, I'm not going to mind it. I'll be like, okay, that was pretty well integrated. That was well done. When it seems cheap or again poorly executed, then you're going to notice that.
I mean, like if you die a bunch and you just get the jump scare every time, you're eventually going to be like, well, fuck this.
Well, I mean, what do you have a specific example that a game that did that?
Well, didn't they do that in Alien kind of? And
no, I mean, not really. Like you knew, like once the alien was on your ass, you're like, well, I'm dead. Like it can get to you fast, but it's not like a jump scare per se. You'll know.
To your point before that we're going to come back to about sound design, ask us again when we come back to sound design.
It ties into that. But like I can't think of a game offhand that like jump scare death you, like essentially. Like I know what you mean, but I can't think of an example.
It's almost like the Batman games where Joker shows up.
Yeah, but like, that's not a jump scare because
I know, I'm not saying that is, but
I know
saying
what you
like
mean,
that's the type of thing that
right.
And I've definitely seen this before. I can't
I 100% believe you, my friend. I just can't think of an example of myself offhand that we can talk about in terms of that. Because I think they're pretty few and far between. Because if there are more of them, I probably can remember one.
But I'll say this, and it's one of those things that with the end of Dying Light and some of the, and I can't think of a specific, so where the jump scares are part of a gauntlet. Maybe you're saying like, so it's just like you die and you're gonna have things jumping out at you. Actually, the end of Dead Space 3, or towards the end, where things are jumping out at you, but it does keep you off balance, but like so much is jumping out at you.
Maybe that's what I was.
Things are.
It might be that.
I definitely did play all the Dead Space games.
Like there's some good death screens. Like Resident Evil again has some good ones. Dead Space also has some good ones when you die. Like some gruesome, vicious like animations, but it's not really a jump scare. It's just like something brutally like dismembering you, and that's like you've died.
Yeah.
But yeah. So he does. So I'll just tie in real quick. He does mention the quintessential example, of course, is the dogs from Resident Evil 1 when they jump through the window. So like that was really effective. I do like how he mentions, and I remember this too, when they remastered it, when they redid it, they changed it up. So like it wasn't quite there. It was somewhere else.
Yeah.
Like the window cracks, but nothing jumps through. Because 20 years later, everyone remembers that. So like, it was a good little subversion on their part.
In Resident Evil 2, you had the Ravens. The police station acted as the same way.
That's right. I forgot about that. But yeah, man. So like, it's, again, the point is, he agrees, it seems. Just think of it in terms of game development that you have to space out your jump scares, or at least place them very carefully and with a lot of intent, because when you go fall off like if you don't strike the right balance, it's going to not be effective anymore, and people are going to either hate it, get annoyed, or just not be engaged with it.
Yeah.
All right, so now we come to one. I think Chris, you wanted to talk a bit about this one. It is called Negative Space. So the idea is just like leaving just a bit of like not giving all the information about. Like, let's say you walk into a room and you see like a creepy painting. You might get a little like text about it or something like that, but it's leaving your space for your player to like fill in the gaps of information that you've hinted at but never actually given them per se.
Right, and I can't think of like it might be one of the Resident Evils, but there's a lot of the best thing I love about Dead Space. There we go. About Negative Space is when is the ability to hide things in plain sight.
Yeah.
Like I think Resident Evil 4, you had something to do with the clock. There was but it was like right there, you didn't see it.
Sure.
And I think that's great because if you have something where there is that tension, where something's out there, or you're trying to. I hate time-based things, so I'm just going to say, if there's a threat, you don't know what's going to come out because these tar monsters or whatever, and to be looking for something and you'd be like, where the fuck is it? And you're going around the living room and and all of a sudden it's like, God damn it, I passed it like 45 fucking times. Yeah. But I think that's really effective because, when you're in a horror movie or whatever, your brain is going fast. You kind of miss details. So like when you're in a horror movie, it's like, dude, go that way, or, grab that thing. Exactly. It's this time because you're in it, you're on guard for other things. You miss what's actually right in front of you, which is something that and the time get irritated about, but like,
sure.
Which is part of the experience. So I think I think the best games do utilize that very well.
Yeah, of course that's going to be true. But yeah, it's an interesting point and something you might not think about, like in terms of all the other like little topics you've covered. It's not like noticeable, but until you think about it, and like, yeah, that's true. And just mention like that also creates like motivation for replays, alternate endings, like weird achievements. So two have come to mind. Two games that I also like within the genre. They're basically horror walking sims, made by the same developers. Was Layers of Fear, and then they made Observer a couple years after that, which I both quite liked. And I think they did a good job in those two games. If nothing else, they have a good talent for like leaving just the right amount of negative space for you to fill in like the blanks of what's happening. And they certainly had like esoteric achievement stuff. Like for example, one I remember was there was a creepy painting, and like it was stand out amongst all the other like creepy paintings that were scattered out the whole fucking game. But it was in a room, like a big room, and if you went to that room and just looked at the painting for like, you have to leave it there for like a minute or two, you got like some achievement, like stare into the eyes of the abyss, or like something like that, right? Yeah. So like it's kind of cool that it's a little detail, a little background, like inclusion. But if you screw around enough and with it, then you get like a little secret little thing or something like that. So yeah.
To me, this is the least horror-based like section.
That's true. It can definitely apply to
this
a wide variety. This
is good advice for all narrative.
Yeah, true.
This has nothing to do with horror to me. I mean, yeah,
nothing specifically.
It applies to horror for sure, but
because it applies to everything.
It applies to everything if you're writing a game.
Yeah, and I'm gonna say a good use for this in a non-horror game that's got creepy elements, or the Arkham games.
Yeah,
sure.
Except Origins, but yeah, but I mean, I agree with you, Stevo. Anytime you can use this effectively, that's really important.
Right.
It's just like I was like, in horror games, you've got the added
horror.
It's in other words,
element.
Whatever you're trying to add to it, using negative space in horror is pretty much a must.
It works differently in every genre, but it's still good.
You have to be aware of it as a concept and utilize it for sure. All right, so now next one. This is probably my favorite one, at least the section I found most interesting. It's called perception hacks. So the idea is like, again, it's similar to jump out scares, only in the sense that they have to be used subtly and almost like sparingly. But when used effectively, it's going to create an unsettling feeling in your player. So an example is, I haven't played this game, but he points out a game called Echo Night Beyond. There's a certain room in which your character walks more slowly than normal. Like you might not notice that like, or at least not consciously, but subconsciously you might. And that like sort of like something was off about what just happened there in the game. Like the game didn't say anything specific or didn't even give me information, but something changed subtly that was sort of like it, not like negative, I guess. I don't know how to describe it, but something was changed or happened that seemed off-putting, which then his tension crank thing like cranks up the tension a little bit more there, and you might not be able to place your finger on it quite why at first, because that's the idea. It's a perception hack, right?
Right.
It's subtly like messing with your senses, but like in a way you don't actually notice consciously, like I said.
I think my favorite part of this section is actually the next sentence after that is when he talks about Silent Hill 4. Silent Hill 4's third-person camera starts to twist about its forward vector as the player approaches the door, making the entrance feel foreboding. Stuff like that is like really cool. Like just the feelings that you can, get from players just by doing like slight little things with the camera. Like your actions, your character's actions completely inform the player's feelings.
Yeah.
And doing like just little things like that with the camera or with the perception of your environment or whatever, like really, really, really makes the difference between a game.
It can make or break like a solid atmosphere or just like one that falls apart.
Exactly. Between
100%.
a game that, like makes you feel like you are, makes the player feel tense as opposed to a player who feels like their character is tense. That's the biggest difference,
Yeah, exactly. Well, yeah, exactly. Well said. I couldn't have said it better myself. So let's move on to one of the final ones that he mentions that we brought up earlier, because we did cover this as its own episode like a season or two ago, but it is, of course, sound design. And I'll read out the first sentence or two. It's difficult to overstate the value of sound design in horror games. 100% agree there. Many of the patterns discussed above can be executed with sound alone, and a skilled sound designer can make even the blandest space feel ominous. I think that's 100% true. Like, it's sort of similar to what you just said. When you notice it, you're like, holy shit, like, of course, isolation, because you can hear the fucking thing running through the rafters above you. Like, it gets louder and louder. You can hear the steps. We mentioned Resident Evil 7.
And you can also, the thing is you could subvert perception of it. You could think it's crawling. But unless you know the layout of the room, you could think it's out of there and it's actually there waiting for you.
Yeah, and this is why, like, probably, like, I have never done it, but many people probably prefer to play horror games specifically with, like, headphones, so you can get, like, the really full effect of sound design, and, like, that's really cool for sure, and, like, yeah, a really well done, team or whoever's doing the sound design, when they're on top of that shit, it's going to, like, make it so much more immersive, and, like, I think one of you mentioned it could even be a clue, like, sort of like that, or other things similar to that. So yeah, like you said, it's difficult to overstate the value of sound design, because it can be one of the things that makes or breaks a good horror game, depending on when it's done well, or again, when not, or if it's just, like, somehow absent, like, or weirdly, like, flat, in a sense.
One of my favorite things, and I know I mentioned this before, but I do have to say, one of the scariest fucking things in any video game ever were those goddamn witches in the Left 4 Dead series.
Yeah.
I mean, because you got the music and then you got the sobbing. Yeah. I mean, it was just the right combination of creep.
Yeah, it was perfect sound design, because it's off-putting, it's tension, you're like, oh shit, and it's one of the hardest enemies to fight, if not the hardest.
It's like the perfect blend of every trope. It's like done very, very well.
Well, yeah, you get the leitmotif in there, and then as soon as you hear that, you know that you're about to fucking
you're like,
deal with
motherfucker.
Some shit. Yeah. God damn.
Where's that crying coming from?
I think that sound design is the most important aspect of a horror game.
I think it's probably...
You could make a fucking, like... I don't know if you guys played Thomas Was Alone, but this is a game about
I know of it, though.
Blocks and, like, shapes. With the right sound design, that game could be terrifying. Like, that's how important sound design is to horror games. Like,
for sure.
If you it's the building block of all atmosphere in horror games. And honestly, good sound design is good for any genre as well.
As you said before, generally, but it's
I would say specifically for horror games, it is, to me, the most important aspect of setting the stage for something creepy or scary going on. And if it's not good, it's not going to be good. I'll say this. Name one horror game that you like that doesn't have good sound together. It doesn't have good sound.
When it sucks, it's going to pull you out of it. Yeah. You're going to totally, like, it's, even if it does other shit well, it's going to lose you because of that. Exactly. And I totally agree. I don't know if it's, like, the most important part. I would say something like, it's one of three things that are both all equal. So, like, if one of them is a little weaker, you're going to notice it. But if all three, like, come together, like two of the other things we mentioned he covers previously, sound design being, like, the third peg in the triangle, if you will, in a sense, the third section. If that's a little weak, it's going to be a little weak overall. And if that's, like, super strong, it's going to be even, you'll notice that and be like, goddamn, that was really well done. Or might be even helpful in game as well, to give you clues and stuff, like the audio cues, as we mentioned as well.
I mean, it's a blending of, and I was looking for the term as you were talking, I was listening. It's cinematically, it's like the in-game noises versus, like, say the movie, music or something that's outside the game. And, like, it got me thinking about when Steve-O said about the witches, you hear the leitmotif and then you hear the external sound and then the internal sound.
Yeah.
So it's a matter of knowing exactly when to use what. I mean, so it's not just enough. It's knowing when to proportion these things out.
Exactly.
And that is...
Well said.
And Steve-O brought it up perfectly with the witches, and that's why that works.
Yeah, for sure. So, before I find the final one is holistic experience, but before that goes on, I want to mention here that as of the time of this recording, a game I've been looking forward to coming out at the end of the month. It's called Cthulhu. It was supposed to come out a while ago. Doesn't matter. It's coming out the day before Halloween this year. And from what I'm trying to like not watch like preview videos or whatever as much, but I still want to see. It's looking very, very good. I don't want to be spoiled or anything. I want to like experience the atmosphere myself. For what I have seen, it's looking quite well, and I hope it's a really good adaptation of one of my favorite authors and settings and atmospheres and so forth. So yeah, just a shout out to that. I will be checking out and playing it, and of course we'll tell you when we get to Games of the Year whether or not it makes it. But just a sort of PSA, if you're into it, it looks like one of a horror game coming out that I've been waiting for.
Horror games.
So yeah, so Holistic Experience is of course just basically putting everything together, and he summarizes it really well, so I'll just read out and not rephrase it. He writes, suspension and tension are hard feelings for games to generate. To scare the player and keep them scared, you need to work full-time, attacking their senses from every possible angle, as we discussed. And the best horror games knock players off balance with their core game mechanics and then focus their attention on a scary narrative. You must think of every mechanic, artistic choice, and as in service to the greater goal of keeping the player focused and feeling disempowered, which is pretty much all the little sections we just said. So yeah, like, this was a pretty damn good article, I think. And again, it was a nice sort of flip side to this the psychological angle that, again, we covered last year. You can check that episode out if you so wish. But it's cool to think about like the actual hardcore mechanics of horror games and like what goes into them and what you need to be aware of and how to use all those little tools, if you will, like effectively.
Yeah, I mean, well said. I don't have too much more to add. It was an interesting article.
We'll put up a link.
I liked reading it. It was pretty quick. Yeah, we'll put up a link and you guys can check it out. We talked about all of it. That's the whole thing. So there you go. Read it or don't, or just listen to this.
Read it and weep.
Actually, read it. Read it. He's much more. He goes more in depth into a lot of this stuff than we did, and you get a couple more examples and stuff like that.
Yeah, for sure. But it's just some cool stuff to keep in mind when and if you are playing your horror games, and if you enjoy them, as I do quite a bit, that you can sort of take a step back, like when you're done, or maybe like taking a break, like take a step back. Oh, that was a really good chapter. I got really intense because. You sort of analyze it. Like, maybe it's not the best thing because then you're sort of like removing yourself and then depowering the fear. But nevertheless, to me, it's interesting to think about these things and hear from people who are working on them, what they think and how they tried to utilize, like I said, the tools available within it to make a really good, effective horror game.
No, I have nothing to add.
All right. Well, like I said, check out Call of Cthulhu, or I'll be doing that soon. And happy Halloween season. I've been Scott Thurlow, and I've been here with Stephen Amosi.
Getting terrified in Newcoma.
And Chris Morgan.
Good night. And John Smith. Check out the Hellfest. I am going to get back to you, brother.
All right. Take it easy, John Smith. Peace. And everyone else. We will see you next time. Good night.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you for joining the Lost Signals Games and Gaming Culture. Check us out on YouTube and iTunes for the shows and more, and on Facebook and Twitter for updates.